The wedding bells echoed faintly through the dense fog that clung to the manor like a shroud, their sound swallowed almost immediately by the looming forest. Agnes glided through the candlelit halls with a grace that seemed less human than spectral, her eyes fixed on the man she had chosen, her husband, trembling but obedient, unsure whether it was awe or unease that kept his feet rooted to the ancient floorboards. Outside, the trees whispered secrets older than memory, their skeletal branches scratching against the windows as if warning of the darkness within. Guests had departed hours ago, leaving the newlyweds alone in a manor that smelled faintly of decayed roses and smoke. Agnes took his hand, pale and cold, and led him down a corridor that no servant or guest had ever noticed. At the end, hidden behind tapestries thick with dust, was a door carved with strange symbols that seemed to writhe when touched. She turned the key with a solemn smile, murmuring words he could not understand but would never forget. The click of the lock resonated through the room like a funeral bell. The chamber was unlike anything he had imagined, walls lined with mirrors reflecting not just his face but the room as it might have been in other centuries, a bed draped in black lace that shimmered unnaturally under candlelight, and an air so thick it felt like it might suffocate him, heavy with promises unspoken and vows unbreakable. As the door sealed behind them, he realized that the manor, the forest, even time itself seemed to bend around Agnes' will. Hours stretched into what felt like lifetimes, and faint whispers slithered from the corners, teasing him, reminding him that he was no longer a visitor but a prisoner of a devotion that would endure forever. Outside, the fog deepened, cloaking the manor in impenetrable darkness, hiding the truth that the villagers had only whispered about for generations, that the bride's chamber was not merely a room, but a place where love and obsession became eternal, and where the line between reality and nightmare could vanish forever. And Agnes, smiling serenely, waited patiently for him to understand, if he ever could, that their wedding night was not meant to end. Agnes was a figure that seemed almost conjured from the shadows themselves, a young woman of delicate frame and ethereal beauty, her presence simultaneously captivating and unsettling. From the moment she was spoken of in whispers among the villagers, there was a sense that she belonged less to the world of the living than to some hidden, darker plane where time moved differently and secrets festered like venom in the air. Her hair, dark as midnight, framed a pale face whose features were refined to a degree that seemed unnatural, as if each contour had been carved with care by someone who understood the delicate balance between attraction and unease. Her eyes, however, were the most arresting feature. They shone with an intensity that could hold a man's attention with the force of magnetism, reflecting both longing and something deeper, something that hinted at obsession. The villagers spoke of Agnes' upbringing with cautious tones, noting the strange routines her family maintained and the heavy emphasis on rituals of devotion that bordered on the obsessive. She had grown up in the forested manor that loomed over the village, a house that seemed alive with its own moods, creaking and whispering as though echoing the thoughts of those who walked its halls. From a young age, Agnes had displayed an unusual fascination with permanence, a need to make every promise and vow indelible, as though fleeting moments of happiness or affection were unacceptable. Those who dared to interact with her often found themselves unnervingly aware of her scrutiny, feeling as if she could perceive not only their words but the very intentions behind them. When the time came for her to marry, her choice of husband was as precise as her gaze, a young man whose character and background suited her vision of companionship, someone she believed she could mold into an extension of her own will. Yet beneath her serene composure, a storm brewed, a blend of desire, control, and a fear of impermanence that she had cultivated into an art form. Her allure was dangerous because it concealed the relentless intensity of her inner life, a mind that measured love not by its natural flow but by the certainty that it could be captured and held forever. In the days leading to the wedding, this duality became more apparent. Agnes moved among the villagers and guests with a grace that charmed and disarmed, but those who lingered in her presence could sense the faint tremor of something unyielding beneath the calm, as though she were already weaving invisible threads that would bind not only her husband but the very moments of their future to her own inexorable design. Her obsession with control, her preternatural focus, and her unwavering vision of eternal devotion all combined to make her a figure whose beauty and menace were inseparable, and whose intentions, though shrouded in gentility, promised a darkness yet to be revealed. The manor where Agnes' wedding was to take place stood hidden deep within the forest, its presence more a rumor than a certainty for most of the villagers who lived beyond the trees' tangled edges. From the outside, the building seemed to emerge from the shadows themselves, its dark stone walls mottled with moss and creeping ivy, and its tall, narrow windows reflecting the grey sky like eyes that never blinked. The path leading to it was little more than a winding trail, overgrown with brambles and twisted roots, forcing travelers to move slowly, their senses alert to every creak of branch and rustle of leaves. Those who had ventured near the manor in the past spoke of strange occurrences, lights flickering behind windows where no one resided, a low hum that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, and the occasional glimpse of figures moving silently along the corridors in the dead of night. The building's history was steeped in whispered warnings. Old letters and fragmented diaries spoke of previous occupants who vanished without explanation, their absence leaving only shadows and rumors in their wake. The villagers, polite yet cautious, had long avoided approaching it directly, instead relying on the occasional glimpse through the fog-laden trees to satisfy both curiosity and unease. Inside, the manor revealed a different kind of terror, one less overt but no less disquieting. The halls were long and narrow, lined with dark wood paneling carved with intricate motifs that seemed to twist when viewed from the corner of the eye, as though the manor itself were subtly rearranging its features. Candlelight flickered across portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow visitors with a relentless attentiveness, and the air carried the faint scent of decayed roses, dust, and something indefinable, a lingering hint of secrets buried beneath the floorboards. Each room was a chamber of possibility, some grand and ornate, others small and suffocating, yet all seemed to hum with an awareness of the guests' movements, responding to fear and hesitation as if the walls themselves were alive. Outside, the forest pressed against the manor like a living wall, its dense canopy blotting out the sun at midday, leaving only shafts of muted light to penetrate the gloom. Birds and animals were rare within the shadow of its trees, and the wind often carried strange, mournful sounds that could be mistaken for human cries or whispered warnings. For Agnes and her husband, the manor offered a seclusion unmatched anywhere else, an environment where they could begin their life together without interruption, but it also carried the weight of history, a presence that reminded them, subtly yet insistently, that the house and its surroundings were not passive observers but participants in a drama older and darker than any human plan, and that the forested manor, with its endless corridors and whispering walls, would play a role far greater than anyone could yet comprehend. The wedding night arrived with a stillness that seemed unnatural, as if the world itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The guests had departed hours before, leaving the manor cloaked in silence that pressed against the walls and seeped into the corners of every room. Candlelight flickered uneasily, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist of their own accord. Agnes moved through the empty halls with a calm that was almost eerie, her footsteps soundless on the worn wooden floors. She extended her hand to her new husband, guiding him with a gentle insistence that left him no choice but to follow. There was a quality in her gaze, sharp and unwavering, that made it impossible for him to question her, as though the very air had thickened around them to bind him to her will. The corridor they traversed was one he had never noticed before, hidden behind tapestries heavy with age and dust, a passage that led deeper into the manor than any guest had ventured. The walls on either side seemed to pulse subtly, as though the house were aware of their movement and conspired to contain them. At the end of the passage, Agnes stopped before a door unlike any other in the manor, its surface carved with strange, twisting symbols that seemed almost to writhe in the flickering light. She paused, her hand lingering on the key that she drew from a ribbon at her waist, and turned to him with a smile that was both serene and unsettling. She spoke softly, her voice a melodic whisper that seemed to resonate in the very air, assuring him that the room beyond was sacred, a chamber for vows that transcended time and mortality. Despite the warmth of her words, a chill settled over him, a subtle fear that he could not name, as though he were stepping into a space where the natural order of the world might no longer apply. The key turned in the lock with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence, echoing through the corridor and down into the forest beyond the manor. The door swung open to reveal a room bathed in candlelight, its walls lined with mirrors and tapestries that depicted ceremonies from ages past, and a bed draped in dark lace that shimmered unnaturally under the flames. The air smelled faintly of smoke and roses, mingled with something indefinably ancient, a scent that hinted at devotion, obsession, and the weight of secrets too long held. As he stepped across the threshold, following her lead, he could not have known that this chamber, chosen so carefully by Agnes, was more than a private sanctuary. It was a threshold into a reality shaped entirely by her will, a space where the moments of their wedding night could stretch into eternity, and where the man who trusted her most would soon discover that the vows spoken there carried consequences far beyond the comprehension of any ordinary heart. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, the atmosphere of the chamber shifted, folding in on itself with a weight that seemed almost tangible. Agnes held the ornate key in her hand for a heartbeat longer, her fingers lingering over its cold metal as though drawing strength from it, and then she placed it carefully on a carved pedestal beside the door. Her actions were deliberate, precise, and imbued with a sense of ritual that made the young husband's heart race with unease. He had assumed the chamber to be little more than an elaborately decorated room, a secret hideaway to celebrate their union in privacy, but the act of locking the door revealed an intention he had not anticipated, a permanence that went beyond mere ceremony. The key itself was ancient, its intricate design unlike anything he had seen, and the way it seemed to hum faintly in Agnes' grasp suggested something beyond human craftsmanship, as though it had been forged with a purpose tied to forces older than the manor itself. She turned to him with a serene smile, eyes glinting with a quiet triumph, and spoke softly, her words almost lost among the flickering candlelight, promising that this room was a sanctuary for their vows, a place where nothing external could intrude upon the sacred bond between them. Yet the assurance that her voice offered was intertwined with an undercurrent of something darker, a subtle warning that the security of the lock was no ordinary barrier. As he looked around, the room revealed details he had not noticed at first glance. The mirrors lining the walls reflected not only his image but fragments of other scenes, fleeting glimpses of past ceremonies, and faces that seemed familiar yet impossible, hinting at lives once present in the same space. The furniture, draped in dark lace and polished wood, exuded an elegance that was almost suffocating in its perfection, each piece positioned with a deliberate symmetry that suggested care beyond mere decoration. The air itself seemed charged, thick with a quiet energy, carrying faint whispers that he could not identify as originating from any human voice, sounds that suggested the room itself was attentive to their presence, aware of the subtle motions of body and thought. Panic, small and insistent, began to creep along his spine as he realized that the lock was more than a simple mechanism. It symbolized a boundary between ordinary reality and a space governed entirely by Agnes' will. Every instinct in him screamed that stepping beyond the threshold of this locked chamber meant surrendering to something beyond comprehension, yet he remained, caught by a mixture of awe, fear, and an inexplicable trust in her. The realization settled slowly, with a dread that grew like shadows in the corners. This was not a room meant to be left once entered, and the simple act of turning the key had begun a process that might bind him far longer than he had ever imagined, tethering his existence to the intentions and desires of the bride, who now held him entirely within her meticulously constructed world. Once the door was sealed, a silence settled over the chamber that was heavier than any sound the husband had ever known, a silence so complete that the faint flicker of candlelight seemed almost too loud against it. At first, he believed it to be mere stillness, the natural hush of an empty room deep in a secluded manor, but soon the whispers began. They were soft at first, barely audible above the rhythmic beating of his own heart, curling around the corners of the walls and slithering along the floorboards like smoke. Sometimes they resembled laughter, distant and light, yet carrying an edge of malice that made his skin prickle. Other times, the words seemed almost familiar, phrases that teased his memory without ever forming coherent sentences, as if the room itself were speaking in a language meant to unsettle rather than communicate. He turned to Agnes, expecting reassurance, yet her serene composure did nothing to calm him. She remained still, eyes glimmering in the candlelight, as if aware of the whispers in ways he could not begin to understand. Moving toward the mirrors lining the walls, he noticed that the reflections did not always match reality. His own face appeared stretched or shifted in subtle ways, sometimes showing expressions of fear he did not feel, sometimes revealing fleeting glimpses of people who had never existed, trapped in the same space he now occupied. The mirrors were not passive observers, they seemed to track him, to respond to his movements and emotions with subtle distortions that unnerved him with their unpredictability. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoed behind him though the floorboards remained unbroken, and shadows moved where no light reached. The chamber seemed to breathe around him, expanding and contracting as if aware of his presence and intent on testing his resolve. He reached for the door, hoping for escape, only to find it unmoving, impervious to his strength, its lock as cold and unyielding as the stone walls themselves. The air grew thick, carrying a faint scent of smoke, roses, and something indefinably ancient, a presence that reminded him that he was not alone and never would be while inside. Every whisper, every flicker of shadow, every distorted reflection contributed to the growing certainty that this chamber was alive in ways beyond human understanding, that it had its own consciousness, attuned to his thoughts, fears, and memories, and that Agnes' influence extended far beyond her physical form. He began to understand that the room was testing him, probing him, and asserting control over every aspect of his perception. The whispers were not idle. They were warnings, promises, and temptations, all layered together into a subtle web that pulled at his mind, leaving him to question the reality of the chamber, the nature of time within it, and whether he would ever distinguish between the voice of his bride and the murmurs of the walls that had begun to speak as if they were alive. As the hours, or perhaps minutes, unfolded within the chamber, he became aware that time itself no longer obeyed any law he had ever known. Clocks on the walls, ornate and meticulously crafted, remained frozen, their hands unmoving despite the passage of what should have been hours. Candles burned unevenly, sometimes seeming to flicker eternally without ever shortening, casting shadows that shifted independently of the flames that produced them. The moon outside the tall windows appeared suspended in one immutable position, its pale light casting the same silvery glow over the bed, the mirrors, and Agnes herself, as if the universe beyond the manor had paused to accommodate this secluded world. At first, he questioned his own senses, convinced that exhaustion or fear was playing tricks upon him, but each observation confirmed the impossible. The room existed outside ordinary chronology, a place where moments could stretch into infinity and hours could collapse into a single breath. He noticed subtle, almost imperceptible changes within the room, like the way the mirrors reflected scenes that were familiar yet impossible, moments that seemed borrowed from yesterday, last week, or a lifetime he had not lived. The bed, draped in dark lace, remained untouched, yet somehow it appeared to grow taller, broader, and then shrink again when he looked away, as if the room itself were breathing. Agnes moved through the space with a calm unaffected by these distortions, her presence grounding yet simultaneously alien, her gaze hinting at a knowledge he could not access, a mastery over this suspended reality that left him both in awe and terror. Shadows shifted unnaturally along the walls, dancing in patterns that defied the candlelight, and at times he could swear he saw reflections of himself that were older, younger, or altogether different, as though the chamber allowed him to glimpse alternate versions of the self he had known. Panic began to settle into a gnawing realization. He had entered a world where time could be manipulated, elongated, or frozen entirely at the will of the room or perhaps of Agnes herself. The air thickened, growing heavy with the scent of incense, decaying flowers, and a faint metallic tang, a reminder that he was not merely witnessing the passage of time differently but living within a temporal anomaly. Every attempt to measure, to mark, or to escape the flow of moments proved futile, for the room resisted and corrected itself with an almost sentient precision. It became clear that the wedding night he had believed would last a few hours had already begun to stretch beyond any conceivable limit, that the ordinary succession of night into dawn no longer applied, and that he was trapped within a continuum where Agnes' will and the chamber's own mysterious power conspired to bind him. He felt the creeping terror of eternity pressing against him, each heartbeat echoing as if amplified, each breath a reminder that he was now a guest in a domain where mortality, expectation, and chronology were irrelevant, and where the very concept of time had surrendered to the chamber's unyielding, eternal rhythm. In the quiet moments when panic had settled into a heavy awareness, he began to notice small details he had previously ignored, signs that the chamber was not simply a room but a repository of history, of lives intertwined with the same suffocating space. In a corner, half hidden behind a velvet drape, he discovered a stack of old journals, their leather covers cracked and brittle with age, yellowed pages bearing ink faded to sepia. Hesitation rooted him for a moment. The handwriting within was meticulous, deliberate, and sometimes frantic, as if penned by hands desperate to record both confession and warning. He read entries that spoke of men who had entered the chamber in the company of Agnes, each convinced of the intimacy and sanctity of the space, only to find themselves ensnared, unable to leave, their presence absorbed into the room itself. Some described fleeting shadows that mirrored their every motion, whispers that anticipated their thoughts, and reflections in the mirrors that moved independently, mocking their attempts to escape or comprehend what was happening. There were accounts of time stretching beyond recognition, of days bleeding into nights that never ended, and of a pervasive sensation that one's soul was being measured, tested, and ultimately claimed. Each entry was more chilling than the last, yet all shared a common thread, the understanding that the room itself was alive in a manner that defied logic, that it had a consciousness intertwined with Agnes' will, and that anyone who entered willingly or out of trust was at the mercy of forces far older and more patient than any human mind could endure. As he turned the pages, the realization settled with growing horror. Agnes was no ordinary bride, and her devotion was not merely emotional or obsessive, but bound to a supernatural mechanism he had only begun to glimpse. The writings hinted at a pact, a design that ensured the eternal presence of those who had entered the chamber, their lives suspended and their identities absorbed into the space alongside the bride's own unyielding intent. The previous occupants were more than victims, they had become part of the room's fabric, their experiences preserved in echoes, reflections, and the shifting patterns of shadows that seemed to respond to his every movement. Each revelation deepened the suffocating awareness that escape was not simply difficult, but perhaps impossible, that the vows Agnes had spoken were entwined with forces capable of bending reality itself, and that he had stumbled into a cycle far older than the manor, older than any conceivable human understanding. The journals were both warning and proof, evidence that the chamber had claimed many before him and that their stories were preserved within its walls, whispering to anyone perceptive enough to hear. The weight of history pressed down upon him, and he felt an almost unbearable certainty settle in. The space had a memory, a will, and an appetite, and that the very act of discovering these writings marked him as the next participant in a fate meticulously orchestrated, inevitable, and eternal, leaving him to wonder not if, but when, he too would become another echo in the chamber's unending record. It was only after hours, or perhaps days, of bewilderment within the chamber that he began to understand the depth of Agnes' intentions and the darkness that pulsed at the core of her devotion. Her calm composure, once almost reassuring, now struck him with the clarity of a revelation. She was not simply obsessive or possessive in the ordinary sense, she was bound by something older, something beyond mortal comprehension, and he had entered the very center of it. The walls, the mirrors, the shadows all seemed to bend subtly to her presence, shifting in ways that suggested not only life but awareness, a responsiveness that made it impossible to deny that Agnes held more than affection, she held power. Her voice, soft and melodic, began to take on new meaning as she spoke of vows, promises, and devotion, hinting that the chamber itself was more than architecture, it was a manifestation of a pact, a covenant forged long before the two of them had met. He recalled fragments from the journals he had discovered, the records of men who had vanished into the same space, their experiences suspended and absorbed into the room, and now the truth pressed upon him like a physical weight. Agnes had entered into a supernatural agreement, a binding of her own soul and the souls of those she loved, designed to ensure eternal union, but union in a sense that transcended life, time, and freedom. She spoke of the chamber as if it were a living entity, an accomplice and a protector, promising that the marriage they shared was unbreakable not by mere human law but by forces older than the manor itself, forces that demanded permanence, attention, and absolute compliance. Her gaze, calm yet intense, fixed upon him with a clarity that left no room for negotiation or defiance, and he felt the truth of it in his very bones. Resistance would not free him, the room and its mistress were aligned, and his will was secondary to the design that had been set into motion. As she revealed the nature of the pact, the whispers in the corners of the room seemed to swell in response, affirming her words, hinting at the countless predecessors whose fates had been sealed in the same eternal cycle. Each subtle movement of the mirrors, each flicker of shadow, each strange distortion in the space confirmed that the chamber was alive in concert with her intent, shaping reality itself around her desire. In that moment, terror and fascination intertwined within him, for he recognized that Agnes' love was absolute, but absolute in a way that annihilated choice, stretched time into infinity, and bound the object of her devotion not to her life but to her eternal will. The realization sank deep, and a creeping despair took hold, as he comprehended that the supernatural pact she had entered was not a relic of the past but a living, active force, and that the bride whose smile had once seemed enchanting was now revealed as the orchestrator of a design that could trap him forever, entwining his existence with hers and with the chamber itself in a cycle from which no man could escape. The first flicker of defiance stirred within him like a fragile spark, a desperate urge to reclaim some portion of the freedom that Agnes' chamber had stripped from him. At first, he moved cautiously, testing the boundaries of the room, pressing his hands against the ornate door and tugging at its lock with increasing force, yet it remained unyielding, cold as stone and unrelenting in its refusal to release him. Panic began to bubble, insistent and raw, gnawing at the edges of his mind as he realized that physical strength alone could not undo the intricacies of the space. The mirrors lining the walls seemed to mock his attempts, reflecting versions of himself that were older, younger, or distorted beyond recognition, each movement mirrored with a cruel, unnatural precision, showing him the futility of resistance. Shadows shifted in response to his motions, coiling around corners and pooling at the edges of the room, as if the space itself were aware of his intent and working to counteract it. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, feeling the room close in around him even as he moved, corridors elongating and folding in impossible geometries that defied the laws of reason. Every object, from the bed draped in black lace to the smallest carved table, seemed to have shifted subtly when he looked away, creating the disorienting sensation that the room was rearranging itself, anticipating his attempts to escape before he had even committed them. The whispers that had haunted him since his arrival intensified, twisting together fragments of his thoughts and fears, whispering doubts that burrowed deep into his mind, convincing him that resistance was meaningless. Yet even as fear clawed at him, a sliver of resolve persisted, compelling him to continue pressing against the boundaries of the chamber, searching for some hidden passage, some weakness that might undo the inevitability of his captivity. Agnes watched with an unflinching calm, her presence both soothing and terrifying, as if every action he took was already accounted for, already folded into the chamber's eternal design. She spoke occasionally, her voice low and deliberate, her words a mixture of comfort and admonition, reminding him that the room had claimed him not through malice but through devotion, that the very act of struggling against it only confirmed the strength of the bond she had forged. As he turned from one mirrored wall to another, the reality of his imprisonment settled in with crushing weight. The chamber was alive, responsive, and infinite, shaped to ensure that no attempt at escape could succeed. Time warped around him, moments stretching endlessly, and the once familiar room became a labyrinth in which every effort to flee only deepened his entrapment. The realization that his fate was entwined with both Agnes' will and the supernatural nature of the chamber left him trembling, caught between fear and the faint, hopeless desire that somehow, someway, he might still reclaim a fragment of liberty even as the walls, the shadows, and the mirrors conspired to prove that the bride's power was absolute, inescapable, and eternal. As the days, or what he perceived as days, folded into an indistinguishable continuum, a suffocating realization settled over him. There was no returning to the world beyond the chamber. Each movement he made, each breath he drew, seemed to echo through the room and linger in the air as though the space itself absorbed him, marking him as permanent, irrevocably bound to Agnes and the eternal night she had conjured. The mirrors continued their subtle distortions, reflecting not only his image but fragments of the countless others who had preceded him, their faces twisted in fear, resignation, or a frozen semblance of obedience, a silent testament to the inevitability of the chamber's claim. Shadows pooled and stretched with unnatural precision, responding to his fear and desire in ways that left no room for denial. The room was not simply a place, but a living participant in his fate, actively shaping the flow of time, bending perception, and enforcing Agnes' will. He wandered the chamber endlessly, yet no corridor led to exit. Every door he tried was either locked, an illusion, or folded back upon itself, forming a labyrinth that existed only to confine him further. The whispers persisted, a constant hum of voices too subtle to fully comprehend yet impossible to ignore, hinting at the stories of the lost and the inescapable truth of the bride's pact. Occasionally, Agnes would move gracefully among the shadows, her presence a serene reminder that resistance was futile, that the room and its mistress were intertwined in purpose, a force beyond mortal defiance. The air thickened around him, carrying faint scents of roses, smoke, and something unidentifiably ancient, a constant reminder that he was trapped not by simple walls, but by a space designed to absorb, manipulate, and ultimately eternalize him. His attempts at reasoning or escape only heightened the chamber's subtle corrections, the mirrors twisting to show him his own futility, shadows coiling to obscure potential paths, and the very floorboards seeming to shift beneath his feet to erase any trace of progress. Slowly, despair became an intimate companion, fear transformed into a steady, gnawing dread, the weight of eternity pressing down with relentless inevitability. He began to perceive time as a fluid, almost malevolent force, stretching and compressing at the chamber's whim, each second a lifetime, each heartbeat a reminder of his inescapable state. In the quiet moments, when Agnes watched him with her unshakable calm, he understood the depth of his entrapment. The wedding night was not a fleeting event but a perpetual reality, a loop without beginning or end. The manor itself seemed to hold its breath outside the chamber, the forest beyond pressing in with patient silence, guarding the secret of his imprisonment. The certainty settled in fully. He was now part of a cycle older than any living memory, bound to Agnes, bound to the room, bound to a devotion that would last not for years, but for all the time the chamber could contain, and he could sense, with a terror that sank into his very soul, that this eternal night had only just begun.